watching right now. President Biden is announcing new actions on climate change. This after West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin refused to support a more comprehensive package of environmental programs. We'll talk to the head of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration about what the Biden administration can do without Congress. Plus, hundreds of millions around the world are seeking relief from record-setting heat. Along with that comes the threat of fires. London's mayor says the city's firefighters had their busiest day since, get this, World War II, and he says it's only just beginning. And on the eve of another primetime hearing from the House Select Committee investigating the January 6th Capitol riot, we are getting a clearer picture of how former President Trump ignored members of his White House and campaign staffs who tried to tell him over and over that he legitimately lost the election to President Biden. Plus, Attorney General Merrick Garland suggests there will be no federal indictment of former President Trump ahead of the midterm elections. We will tell you why. And later this hour, every time you use your smartphone, you are leaving behind a trail of data, not only for the government, but for interested third parties, too. And we will talk to someone who sued the federal government to figure out just how much of your personal information is at risk. But we begin with record temperatures across the United States today. More than 100 million Americans are under excessive heat advisories. Today, President Biden announced executive orders to tackle climate change, including funding for cooling centers.
So we have to act. Extreme weather disrupts supply chains, causing delays and shortages for consumers and businesses. Climate change is literally an existential threat to our nation and to the world.
For more on this and other topics, David Drucker and Natalie Jennings join me now. David, as you might remember, senior correspondent at the Washington Examiner. He's also author of In Trump's Shadow, The Battle for 2024 and the Future of the GOP. It's a good book. And Natalie is a senior politics editor at Vox. David, let me start with you. So there's always a new poll to discuss. We have a new one today from Quinnipiac. It shows President Biden hitting a new approval low of 31%. Worse, that poll says 7 in 10 Americans surveyed don't want the president to run again. Even so, 60% also say they don't want Donald Trump on the ticket in 2024. What to make of this revulsion with the replay of the 2020 election?
Well, a couple of things, Major. I think what's important to understand here is that one of the reasons why President Biden's poll numbers are so low is because Democrats are unhappy with him. They're frustrated with him. Some of these Democrats are going to show up and vote in midterm elections. They're going to vote for Democratic candidates. But when members of your own party, when voters that tend to support your party are unhappy with leadership at the top, a lot of them can end up staying away at the polls because they're just not that inspired. And I think what it shows when you look at those numbers with Trump is that the country, broadly speaking, is hungry for fresh leadership, somebody who has not been on the scene for decades. And even though Trump is relatively new on the political scene, he's a face that Americans have known for decades. And of course, he was so in our face and continues to be in our face for the past 6 years or so that maybe it feels like he's been around almost as long as Joe Biden. And I think that both parties would do themselves a service politically if they could put forward some new faces to lead the country in 2024. It's unclear if Republicans will do that simply because Donald Trump retained so much support from the Republican base, despite having lost re-election and everything that went along with that. And look, President Biden continues to be one of the strongest Democrats on the presidential bench. He's the incumbent. He sort of has right of first refusal. And if he wasn't as old as he is, I don't think we'd be talking about the possibility of new blood at the top of the ticket the way we are. But I think it shows you that Americans are looking for something new. The question is whether they'll actually support somebody new if somebody new puts themselves forward.
Right. Seeking something new and getting something new in politics, two very different things. Natalie, as you well know, there's this sort of silver lining Democrats keep clinging to when they look at all of this bad polling data around President Biden. And that silver lining is that Democrats still run competitively and in some surveys outperform Republicans in generic polls ahead of the midterms. What do you make of that?
That's right. There's been a string of these polls in the last week or two that show on a generic ballot, what would you prefer, a Republican or a Democrat? Voters giving a slight edge to Democrats. That's happening, as David was just saying, as President Biden is bottoming out, as it were. And so it's pretty unusual to see the separation, but there's a couple of factors that you could that I think explain it pretty well. One is that we're starting to see gas prices creep a little down. I know inflation is still up, but people are feeling a little relief there. There's the big abortion decision that these latest round of polls are just taking stock of people's mood about it. They know who is unaffiliated or who is affiliated with that decision and who is not. And then we're starting to see these general election races settle out, people seeing who is actually going to be their representative. And they are starting to unusually make a differentiation between Biden and those members of Congress who would represent them. So those are sorts of things that are happening right now. Whether that keeps the trend line going for the next couple of months is the next big question.
Sure. And Natalie, to your point, I'm sure the White House hopes that the president's poll numbers have, in fact, bottomed out. David, the House passed a bill yesterday that codifies same-sex as well as interracial marriage. While Republicans are, of course, understandably leaning into the economy, inflation as a midterm issue, you're a very cagey observer of Senate Republicans in that conference. What do you think Senate Republicans are going to do when this bill gets over to the Senate?
Yeah, this is a really fascinating question, Major. You know, you had 47 House Republicans jump on that bill.
Mommy's on TV. You need to stay over there in the corner.
Really put some pressure on Democrats in the Senate to move the bill, and it gives some breathing room for Republicans to support the bill. So the big question is, can we get 10 Senate Republicans to put together with all 50 Democrats to break a filibuster and get this thing to Joe Biden's desk? And I think there's a real possibility this is going to happen. I think you begin with 4 yes votes right off the bat: Rob Portman, Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, and Tom Tillis from North Carolina indicated he's ready to support it. Interestingly, the minority leader, Mitch McConnell from Kentucky, is non-committal. And I think there's a possibility that he gives his blessing to this bill and supports it. I don't know that he's going to do that. His office is playing very coy. McConnell is playing very coy. And lots of Republicans are sort of throwing the ball up in the air here and trying to figure out where it's going to land and how they want to catch it. I think the only way we're going to know what happens is if Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer puts this thing on the floor. And I think that if you care about passage of this bill, politically, the best thing for it is for it to be put on the floor before the August recess. Members are going to go home for a month, 5 weeks or so, talk to a lot of voters. And I think that the more Republicans think about this, the more feedback they get from the Republican base. It's unclear if these 10 Senate votes from the Republican side materialize. But I think the fact that this could actually get across the finish line and render the Obergefell decision from 2015 that legalized same-sex marriage nationally not, the linchpin in marriage rights for same-sex couples is a very big deal. And whereas 10 to 20 years ago, you'd say this was a tougher vote for Democrats, this is now a much tougher vote for Republicans. And the best thing they could do politically would be to support this and get it off the table. The question is, will they?
David, your experience and mine is when the Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell is non-committal, he's usually looking for a way to get to yes. Natalie, I want to talk to you about something that happened near the end of President Trump's term. There were court challenges about adding a census question on citizenship to the census, and the president at his time and the administration said they were not really working on that. There were no implications politically for Republicans, but a new congressional report has come out. What did it say?
It looked at communication that happened way back at the beginning of the Trump administration when they were trying to, at the Commerce Department, figure out a way to rationalize putting this question of whether citizenship status should be on the census, onto the census. We got a look in a report that came out today from the House Government and Oversight Committee about what they found when the Biden administration finally turned over communication from the Commerce Department about this. And we saw a series of kind of communications that were done carefully that did show that they were aware that there was precedent against putting this question on the ballot, that it was unlikely to withstand a legal challenge, and that they knew that they were doing something that would kind of mask the rationale that was really the rationale why they wanted to do this, which was to maybe keep numbers low of undocumented immigrants. So now we see that in these messages that were released this week.
Very good. David, last night, Dan Cox, a candidate endorsed by former President Trump, won the Republican primary for Maryland governor, beating out Kelly Schulz, who was endorsed by outgoing and very popular Maryland Republican Governor Larry Hogan. So, proxy battle is a phrase we use commonly. How much was this a referendum on the former president in Maryland?
Well, I think it shows you where the Republican base is in Maryland, and that's not surprising. And look, Larry Hogan isn't the first Republican to have trouble transferring his popularity to an endorsed candidate. Donald Trump's had some of those issues in Georgia, Idaho, Nebraska, and in some key congressional races. I think the bigger issue here, Major, is that this was yet another Republican primary where Democrats and Democratic groups poured a lot of money into a Republican primary to elevate the so-called unelectable candidate. Now, Dan Cox probably can't win in deep blue Maryland, but I think this is important because Democrats, and this is a key part of their 2022 messaging, and it'll be a key part of their 2024 messaging, is that Republicans, particularly Trump-aligned Republicans, are a threat to American democracy. And coming out of what happened on January 6th, 2021, and the 2020 election, there's a case that Democrats can make to independent and swing voters that Republicans are problematic on this issue. But when you're spending lots of money to nominate these same kinds of Republicans, it really undermines your message. And the message it could send to swing voters and to others is that you really don't believe Republicans are a threat to democracy, because you're treating all of these Republicans the same way you've always treated them. Politically, it makes a lot of sense. You try and get the other candidate that's non-electable across the finish line. It's an easier general election out. But in a forming Republican wave where anything might be possible, Democrats, as I've talked to Trump critics, they say Democrats are playing with fire on this, and they very well could be.
Natalie, the Speaker of the Wisconsin Assembly said just last week he fielded a request from former President Trump to decertify the 2020 election results. After the conversation, Mr. Trump criticized Speaker Robin Vos about ballot drop boxes in that state. Is there an overlap or any overlap on this issue potentially for Republicans, or is it in any way problematic going forward?
It's problematic in that this is not proving to be a very winning issue for Trump. It's reminding a lot of Republicans what they didn't like about the Trump era. We're seeing his support erode among them already. And we're not seeing a lot of, messaging from Trump on issues that a lot of the Republican base cares about right now, and a lot of the general public. And so that's not doing anyone any favors. This is something in a very important swing state that a lot of Republicans who want to win there in Wisconsin would rather not be talking about. And that's grabbing a lot of attention once again this week because of Trump's actions 18 months after he was, after January 6th happened.
18 months indeed. Natalie Jennings, David Drucker, thanks so much for your time. The January 6th House Select Committee will hold its next hearing tomorrow. It will focus on what former President Trump was doing or not doing during the Capitol riot. Former National Security Council official Matthew Pottinger and former White House Deputy Press Secretary Sarah Matthews will appear. The panel was hoping to receive a month's worth of text messages from the Secret Service ahead of this hearing, but only one text exchange has so far been delivered. The National Archives has called for a review of the Secret Service's, quote, unauthorized deletion of text. For more on all of this, I want to bring in Scott MacFarlane and Catherine Herridge. Scott is CBS News congressional correspondent. Catherine, CBS News senior investigative correspondent. Catherine, Matt Pottinger is one of the witnesses testifying tomorrow night. As we said, remind us of who he is and why his testimony could be of considerable interest.
Major Pottinger is a deputy national security advisor. A close colleague has described him to CBS News as a very serious professional, a straight shooter, someone with a lot of principle. And if you think back to January 6th, there were the tweets from President Trump attacking Vice President Pence while the violence unfolded on Capitol Hill. And it was those tweets that prompted Pottinger to resign on January 6th, and he was the highest-ranking White House official to do so.
Catherine, where does former national security official Charles Kupperman come into play in all of this?
Okay, so Kupperman is also a former deputy national security advisor. He told CBS News that on January 6th at around 3 p.m., he received a call from a contact that notified him that the D.C. mayor was having trouble getting through to the White House. Kupperman confirmed that he reached out to Pottinger, who then went to White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows to find out about the status of the Guard. And according to Kupperman, Pottinger reported back that Meadows thought the order to deploy the National Guard had already been given. But if you look at this Defense Department timeline, what you see in the timeline is that it looks like that order was only given verbally after 3 o'clock. So it paints a picture of a lot of confusion over the status of this deployment, which, of course, was imperative at that point in the afternoon.
Scott, former White House Press Secretary Sarah Matthews will also testify. Is she expected to shed light on anything of significance tomorrow?
Yeah, I asked one of the committee members about that a short while ago, Major. She was part of that shrinking White House inner circle on January 6, 2021, one of the staffers that was still there in the 11th hour of the administration. The committee says what they're trying to do, what's best to be done, is to show their presentation and, for lack of a better phrase, tell their story through the voices of people who are inside the inner circle, that it has the most integrity, that it has the most credibility if they're doing a presentation that includes the voices of people who had the ear of the former president. Sarah Matthews on January 6, 2021 was one of the dwindling number of White House staffers who still had access to the inner circle and still had the ear of people in close proximity to former President Trump. That's why these two aides are being asked to testify.
Catherine, try to help us out with this. So confusion, chaos on January 6th, that's clear. It's probably going to become more clear tomorrow night. But does that equal criminality?
Well, Major, I think you understand, amongst others, that really there's a very high bar if they were going to bring a criminal prosecution of a former president. One legal expert said to me that this is just not a moment where you want to try out a new legal theory. So you're looking at a handful of possible charges. One would be conspiracy. But so far, we have not seen evidence of direct coordination between President Trump and the rioters that day. Number two, you could look to this issue of obstruction. You'd have to have good evidence that he was tampering with witnesses. The third, and what's considered, based on my context, the most likely avenue, which would be this electors case down in Georgia, where the state statute is pretty clear.
We'll have more on that in a little bit. Scott, a bipartisan group of senators, and this is important, introduced legislation to update, very long ago, 1887 Electoral Count Act. What is it? Does it have a chance?
It's obscure, but it's important. What it would do, among other things, is raise the threshold of the number of members of the House and Senate who would have to object on future January 6s before it breaks down the process and sends those chambers into their own separate debates over the integrity of the electoral vote. At this moment in time, and on January 6, 2021, just one member of the House and one member of the Senate was necessary, and that threshold was easily met. But what's important here is where this legislation is being generated. It's in the U.S. Senate. That's because we know the January 6th committee in the House has expressed interest in that type of bill. So there may already be a companion. This might be on a trajectory towards movement before the end of the Congress, a Congress which has very few legislative days remaining.
Scott, you've also been paying very close attention to Steve Bannon's trial and contempt of Congress charges. What are prosecutors arguing, and how's it going?
Well, it was characterized as the misdemeanor from hell by Steve Bannon, but it's ended up being a very routine federal prosecution. Pretty dry testimony. Today it was a January 6th committee staffer testifying about subpoena deadlines and email chains about the receipt of subpoenas. What's really been coloring these proceedings is Steve Bannon doing a post-game news conference each day outside the courthouse. He has very limited defenses. The judge has precluded other defenses he's tried. He'll be limited to arguing tomorrow that he didn't understand the deadline on the subpoena, the October 2021 deadline, to be firm. He's going to argue he thought it was negotiable.
For your expertise, Scott McFarland and Catherine Herridge, we thank you. And a reminder, CBS News will have full coverage of tomorrow's primetime hearing. It is expected to get underway at 8 p.m. Eastern. We will have a team of correspondents and analysts to break it all down. That's right here on CBS News. Merrick Garland is not closing the door to a possible prosecution of former President Trump. What the Attorney General is saying about what would have to happen before Mr. Trump could be charged. You are streaming Red and Blue.
CBS News Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley on CBS.
When weather is about to get extreme,
we're talking about hail, we're talking about tornadoes, damaging winds.
Every second counts.
Let's now take a look at what that really means to you.
That's why CBS News and the Weather Channel have come together to bring you virtual weather technology so advanced, so real.
We can show you what it's going to look like when the storms come through.
You'll see what will happen, where it will happen, before it does. Feel the forecast on CBS News. Time to get prepared.
I'm Nora O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
We've never done an interview like this before.
That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News. What's your message to consumers? They need help now. Tell him I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Nora O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount+.
We will witness yet another moment in history.
A memo recently issued by Attorney General Merrick Garland suggests there will not be a federal indictment before the November midterms of former President Trump, this pertaining to his conduct either leading up to or on January 6th. The Attorney General told DOJ officials and staff in May that extra steps are required before bringing charges against any major political figure in an election year. At a press conference today, our CBS News Chief National Affairs and Justice Correspondent Jeff Pegues asked the Attorney General about this.
And these mean no partisan considerations in prosecutorial and investigative work. It means treating like cases alike, regardless of whether the subject or target is a friend or a foe, or rich or poor, or Republican or Democrat.
We are entering a zone here where if there are charges brought against a former president related to January 6th, DOJ could be accused of playing politics. How is the department, how are you weighing that? Also, do you think that there is a constitutional question involved here about whether you charge a former president for actions allegedly taken during his term?
Look, no person is above the law in this country. Nothing stops us.
Even a former president?
I don't know how to, maybe I'll say that again. No person is above the law in this country. I can't say it any more clearly than that.
So this is obviously a very big topic, and there are probably few people in America better able to help us understand it than Lawrence Tribe. Professor Tribe is Harvard University Professor of Constitutional Law Emeritus. Professor Tribe, it's always great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us. So I've heard various interpretations of this memo. One, oh no, the sky's falling, the Justice Department's not going to do anything. Another saying, no, hold on. This is standard process. Don't jump to conclusions. Help the audience understand it best you can.
I think it's very clear that the memo didn't add anything that we didn't already know. It was a memo dated May 25th of this year. I think people made a big deal out of it, but it was simply standard procedure. The Attorney General has to sign off personally before an investigation is begun of a major political figure in a political year. But number one, the investigation, I think, has already begun. Number two, I know Merrick Garland well. He was my student. It doesn't take him long to sign off on things. And number three, he made clear in talking to your excellent journalist today that nothing will stop him from indicting a former president, including President Trump, if the evidence warrants. And I think we're seeing the evidence clearly warrants it. So I'm really quite encouraged.
And Professor Tribe, to your point about it doesn't stop an investigation. So if one is already going on, there's nothing about this memo that puts the brakes on that process.
Nothing at all. And all the people, and I'm among them, who have expressed occasional impatience, forget that unlike Fannie Willis and the Georgia procedure, the federal procedure is locked down. It's conducted in a very secret way. All kinds of stuff is going on. I'm amazed to hear so many people say that the January 6th committee, which I think is doing a brilliant job, is ahead of the Justice Department. How do they know? For all they know, apart from Cassidy Hutchinson, who apparently was something of a surprise to the Department of Justice, the department knows everything the committee knows and more. They want the committee's transcripts. Of course they do, because they want to double check everything they've got. But right now, I think there is no reason to panic and every reason to think that the process is moving forward. I wish it would move even faster, but if wishes were horses, then, we could all ride.
Professor Tribe, what has been your sense, and what do you think is the historical takeaway from what we have observed from the January 6th committee thus far?
Well, I think the historical takeaway is that because never in our history have we had a president who was completely unwilling to take no for an answer when the people vote him out of office, and the Electoral College has voted and has said, you've lost, and all the people around him have said, you've lost, is basically said, I don't care what anyone says, I'm going to hold on to office no matter what. And the committee has shown us very clearly, step by step, and I think we'll show even more tomorrow night on live television, that this was a president who, even when he learned that the mob was armed, said, that's great, let's take down the magnetometers, have them march on the Capitol. They're not going after me. He made it clear that they were going after his vice president. They were going to interrupt the proceedings. They were going to interfere with the peaceful transfer of power for the first time in over 2 centuries. And the committee has made clear how extraordinary that was, how powerful. The evidence is that this president was not going to take no for an answer. We came awfully close to losing our democracy. And the committee is going to recommend changes in the law to make it harder for a coup to occur again.
Professor Tribe, you know that there is a spirited debate going on journalistically and legally about whether or not it is good for this country to see an indictment, even if there's evidence to support it, of a former president. Those who are cautious about that say that's banana republic stuff. We get into an era where even if there's legitimate evidence, it looks like it's all politics, and that will forever change America's relationship to a former president. Where do you come down on that?
Well, it seems to me it would look like politics if evidence of severe criminality, treachery, seditious conspiracy on the part of a former president ended up with no accountability. That would be a banana republic. But all of these metaphors about how it's a banana republic, how terrible it would be, sure, it would not be a good thing. There would be a lot of unrest. But think how terrible it would be if we establish the precedent going forward that a president can basically engage in a seditious conspiracy, foment a violent insurrection that results in at least 7 deaths, come awfully close to ending the transition of power, and then what? Nothing happens, a big nothing. That would be the worst possible outcome for the future of our democracy. I hope it doesn't end up that way.
And Professor, do you believe from an evidentiary point of view that burden has already been met, either through the January 6th committee hearings or what you imagine justice is pulling together?
Well, there are a few more dots to be connected. I'm not ready to say that the proof is immediately there beyond a reasonable doubt, but there is far stronger proof than in almost any prosecution I've seen. And until the jury speaks, we really won't know. But I do think the proof is there. I think with more evidence, a little more evidence, that I'm sure the Justice Department is in a better position through its subpoena power to collect than even the subpoena power of the committee, with a little more evidence that shows the agreement between Trump and Stone, Trump and Giuliani, Trump and any number of other figures to foment the violence, then it will all be there. But even now, the proof is there. For example, with respect to strong-arming Raffensperger to steal the votes of Georgia, that's already there. That's why I expect an indictment from Fannie Willis in Fulton County, Georgia, even before an indictment from the Department of Justice.
Harvard's Lawrence Tribe, we thank you very much for your time, sir.
Thank you, Garrett.
A new poll finds the U.S. Supreme Court's approval rating has fallen significantly since the overturning of Roe v. Wade. According to the survey from Marquette University Law School, 38% of Americans currently approve of the High Court. That number represents a notable decline from the Supreme Court's 60% approval rating in July of last year through the same polling organization. And 67% of people polled this month also said they now view the court as conservative. That's up from 56% in May. Coming up, Ukraine's First Lady is calling on the U.S. for more help to fight off Russia's military assault. Elena Zelenska's plea to U.S. lawmakers as Russian forces make renewed efforts to resume their offensive in eastern Ukraine. Plus, President Biden unveils a plan he hopes will help cities cope with extreme heat. I will speak to NOAA's administrator and ask why the White House stopped short of declaring a national climate emergency. You are streaming CBS News.
CBS News Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley on CBS.
When weather is about to get extreme.
We're talking about hail, we're talking about tornadoes, damaging wind.
Every second counts.
Let's now take a look at what that really means to you.
That's why CBS News and the Weather Channel have come together to bring you virtual weather technology so advanced, so real.
We can show you what it's going to look like when the storms come through.
You'll see what will happen, where it will happen, before it does. Feel the forecast on CBS News. Time to get prepared.
I'm Nora O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
We've never done an interview like this before.
That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News. What's your message to consumers? They need help now. Tell him I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Nora O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount+.
We will witness yet another moment in history.
Welcome back to Red and Blue. I'm Major Garrett. Here's a look at some of our top stories. The House has passed legislation to protect same-sex marriage and interracial marriage, this following the Supreme Court's overturning of Roe v. Wade. The bill now heads to the Senate, and some Republicans have already expressed support for it. Plus, a judge is ordering former President Trump's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, to testify before a Georgia grand jury. Giuliani is expected to detail his role in 2020 election interference. A subpoena issued earlier this month said Giuliani made false claims of widespread voter fraud in Georgia. And extreme temperatures are worsening wildfires in more than a dozen states. More than 120 million Americans are under excessive heat warnings and advisories. The record heat has killed around 2,000 people in Europe. CBS News correspondent Chris Van Cleve joins me now from a very hot Dallas. So at one level, this is a very ordinary story. It's the middle of the summer and it's hot. Okay, of course it is. And yet there's evidence that something else is happening. One of the things, amid this heat wave nationally, 85 wildfires in 13 different states. Chris, we'll talk about Texas very specifically in a minute, but just talk to the audience about that part of the story.
Yeah, you have 18 fires now burning just across the state of Texas. Around 85, and those are major fires burning across the United States, 13 states, more than 3 million acres. It used to be, even in places like California that had noted wildfire seasons, that it had a season. it would be hot for a period of time. There were fire risks because of wind. Well, that fire season is virtually year-round, and it's not just California. That is creeping further and further east, where you see wildfires not only in the summer but in the spring. It is a threat to homes. We've seen more than a dozen homes here in Texas lost just this week because of fires, but it's also to infrastructure as well as to the environment. There's a fire burning in Yosemite National Park right now that threatens some of the oldest trees in North America, landmarks of the Yosemite Park, things that people come from around the world to see. And we're seeing those sort of old growth grand sequoias being threatened in California routinely now because of fires burning in places where 10, 15, 20 years ago you maybe wouldn't have seen fires, and fires starting at times where you wouldn't normally see them.
Chris, let's zero in on Texas a little bit. Earlier in my career, I lived in Texas twice. Amarillo for 2 years, Houston for 2 years. Texans know from summer heat, but this is definitely different. Talk to the audience about how it's different and being experienced differently in Texas this summer.
Sure thing. Well, one, we're not even through July. It's already the third hottest July on record, and it is not far off from the hottest July on record. It's been 24 or 25 days in triple-digit heat. August-like weather started at the end of May and is likely to continue through September. So yes, Texas is hot, but it is hot. It got hotter sooner, and it is staying hotter longer. The Dallas-Fort Worth area hasn't seen measurable rain in 46 days. 99% of Texas is experiencing drought conditions of some extent, and when that drought survey is updated next week, that number will likely be even higher, closer to the entire state in drought conditions. You can liken much of Texas to a tinderbox. And now you have winds today, a red flag warning. That's something you talk about in California when they worry about the winds that can blow wildfires. Same concern here. It is also, Major, the other thing, Texans are used to the heat, yes, but the population of Texas is growing and the makeup is changing. People are coming to Texas in large numbers for many Texas recent transplants. This level of heat may be a surprise, but we're seeing a doubling in the number of emergency calls because of heat issues. So even Texas residents, folks that know it's hot, are still falling victim to this heat, in part because day after day after day of 100, 105, 110, that's cumulative, and it takes a toll. Eventually, your body just doesn't keep up.
So in a situation like this, Texas, like other states that are experiencing long periods of excessive heat, have their resource allocation issues. What kind of resource issues is or will Texas face adapting to this prolonged heat wave?
Yeah, Major, the biggest question for people in Texas has been the power grid. We saw it fail rather spectacularly during an ice storm in February of 2021. There has remained real concerns about if it's hardy enough to weather any kind of severe weather, and that includes high heat. We have seen peak demand here day after day after day over the last 6 to 8 weeks. So far, that power grid has held. That's a big relief for people because the agency that runs it had warned it may need to go to rolling blackouts if demand is too high. Now, they're running almost at the margin, so that remains a big concern. Water is going to be an increasing concern. We're already seeing farmers have to sell off cattle by the thousands because the grasslands that they would eat are dying and the water that the cows would drink is evaporating. That lack of rain is significant. And, as you look at the tendency for things to get hotter, things to get drier, weather to get more extreme, that means droughts last longer. Water is certainly going to be something, a commodity that's going to become very valuable here in Texas, much the way you're seeing conversations about water in Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and Colorado right now.
One last question, Chris. Texas's cities expand a lot because there's lots of land, which means generally there's lots of concrete. Concrete intensifies heat. What are urban areas doing to try to address that problem and serve their residents who need a break from the heat? Are there any interesting things you're seeing playing out in the urban parts of Texas to help their residents cope?
Well, yeah, Texas certainly likes its concrete, and I can tell you, standing on the blacktop and the concrete here adds another 15, 20 degrees to the heat. It gets real hot real fast. You know, cooling centers are open throughout the city of Dallas. Every public library has pallets of water and is open to anybody who needs to come in and cool off. But and again, you're seeing that in places like Boston today as well. You know, you have water parks, and a lot of the outdoor areas have those sort of splash zones that kids can play in. But really what they're encouraging people to do is stay out of the heat and drink a lot of water. And that sounds so obvious, but paramedics say in almost every instance where they get a heat call, not drinking enough water and staying out in the heat too long are the things that really do people in.
You're standing out in the heat, and we appreciate it. Chris Van Cleve, thanks so very much.
Sure thing.
As we've been reporting, President Biden spoke about tackling the climate crisis in Massachusetts today. The president called global warming a, quote, emergency, but he held off declaring a so-called national climate emergency, which would have made some funding authority and other powers available to his administration. Instead, the president announced a suite of executive actions to come that he said will combat climate change.
In the coming days, my administration will announce the executive actions we have developed to combat this emergency. We need to act. But just take a look around. Right now, 100 million Americans are under heat alert. 100 million Americans.
For more on the heat alerts, the implications, and other climate science issues, I want to bring in Richard Spinrad. Richard is the administrator of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Richard, NOAA produces a tremendous amount of data on all of these scientific atmospheric issues. It tracks heat. Talk to my audience about the implications of heat. As I understand it, it's the biggest killer of all weather-related phenomenon, and where we actually are in this particular summer of excessive heat.
Yeah, that's right, Major. Heat is a real killer and a very serious consequence of climate change and impact on the whole American population. In fact, as we speak, 100 million Americans, a third of our population, is under a heat advisory. 200 million Americans can expect to see temperatures over 90 degrees through Friday of this week. And for those of us who are on the East Coast, the whole I-95 corridor from D.C. up to Boston is apt to see temperatures close to 100 degrees through this weekend. And it has consequences. We've seen in Europe, for example, 1,700 people have been killed in this heat wave that's hitting right now. So it has impact on our health. It has impact on our infrastructure. It has impact on our ability to generate electricity. And it really is something we all feel. And all too often, I feel, the public gets good warnings of the kind of heat that we may expect, but really does not feel that they have to take action. So our job in the administration generally and in NOAA specifically is to get the products out and also let people know what the impacts of that heat are apt to be.
And you talked about the administration. Realistically, what can it do short, medium, long term to address all this?
There are a number of things that we can do. And in fact, the administration, since day one, when President Biden announced the climate crisis as one of our top areas of concern and an area of focus for the administration, we've been making investments. So, in fact, even today, we saw that FEMA has identified $2.3 billion to help communities be more resilient to the impacts of climate change, including heat. We also saw Health and Human Services provide additional guidance today for low-income families on what to do with heat impacts. And in our own agency, NOAA, we're taking a close look at how we can start building products around what we call the urban heat island effect and really identify those areas within our major cities where heat can be particularly a problem. Cities oftentimes can see temperature differences of 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit from other areas. And so when you've got a heat wave like the one we're seeing right now, the consequences can be quite dire, especially in some of the cities. So there are investments, there are programs, and I'd say, as you can probably tell, I've been in the federal government for quite some time. I've never seen the all-of-government approach like what we're seeing right now, Major, in terms of agencies working in interagency discussions to try to identify products and services that will help American people and the American industries.
Rick, as you well know, there's been lots of conversation, a few headlines on stories about will the president declare a national climate emergency, and if he did so, what powers would that give him that he doesn't currently possess? For our audience who doesn't really understand the intricacies of all that, what difference would it make if the president, this president or any president, were to declare a national climate emergency?
So the president might make that announcement, but I think it's important for your audience to recognize we're moving out. The administration is making investments. We're building programs. You know, the president was a strong champion of the bipartisan infrastructure law, where we've seen billions of dollars start to be invested to give the American public the products they need, both to mitigate the impacts of climate change, but also to adapt and be more resilient to them. So I'm excited. I know the White House will be making additional announcements in weeks to come, and we're not waiting. We're moving out right now. We're engaging with the public, with users. We're building products and services as we speak.
Rick, let's talk about some fossil fuel realities. Democratic governors in multiple states have recently instituted gas tax holidays to alleviate high prices. That would, in likelihood, increase consumption of gasoline because it'll be a little bit cheaper. How do you square that with a long-term strategy of weaning America off fossil fuels to combat these climate change, temperature, and weather-related issues?
I think one of the most important things to recognize, and one of the things I'm proudest of in this administration, is that decisions, whether they be policy or program decisions, are predicated on the best science. And so my own agency, NOAA, is a science-based agency, and our job is going to be to look at the various policy options, answer the question of, if we do this, what will the consequences be? If the use of carbon-based fuels changes, what will happen to the climate? What will happen in terms of sea level rise, in terms of weather patterns? And we believe that if we can arm the policy decision makers with the best scientific information, we can make the kind of decisions you alluded to on a much more informed and better basis.
And Rick, right before I let you go, real quick, is your agency under less constraints on that scientific information and communicating it to the administration than it was, say, under the Trump administration?
Our agency is working aggressively to develop a whole spectrum of products. And I think the challenge we've got is prioritizing where to build which products. And I would say that we've got extraordinary support at the highest levels in the administration to build those products, make the investments in research, and work with communities and industries to give them what they need.
Rick Spinrad of NOAA, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
We will be right back. You are streaming Red and Blue on CBS News.
CBS News Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley on CBS.
When weather is about to get extreme.
We're talking about hail, we're talking about tornadoes, damaging winds.
Every second counts.
Let's now take a look at what that really means to you.
That's why CBS News and the Weather Channel have come together to bring you virtual weather technology so advanced, so real.
We can show you what it's going to look like when the storms come through.
You'll see what will happen, where it will happen, before it does. Feel the forecast on CBS News. Time to get prepared.
I'm Nora O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
We've never done an interview like this before.
That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News. What's your message to consumers? They need help now. Tell him I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Nora O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount+.
We will witness yet another moment in history.
The American Civil Liberties Union has obtained documents from the Department of Homeland Security that show widespread collection and use of cell phone location data within some of its agencies. For more on this, I want to bring in Nathan Freed-Wessler. He is the Deputy Director of the ACLU Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project. Nate, it's great to talk to you. What prompted the ACLU's request? How did you obtain these government records? And be specific about what kind of data this is.
So in February of 2020, the Wall Street Journal reported that the Department of Homeland Security, including Customs and Border Protection and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, had been buying access to huge quantities of American cell phone location data. Within a couple of days, we filed a Freedom of Information Act request with those agencies. They didn't respond for months and months. So at the end of 2020, we sued. And over the last year plus, we've been receiving documents, which we released to the public this week. What these documents show is these federal agencies, immigration enforcement and criminal investigative agencies, buying access to staggering quantities of Americans' location history without a warrant, without any judicial oversight. So the data that we're talking about here comes from our cell phones. Most people who have a smartphone have dozens, maybe even hundreds of apps on those phones. Some of those apps are collecting location information. Sometimes there's a good reason for that, a mapping app, a weather app that we want to be able to give us the weather when we arrive in a new city. But unbeknownst to most of us, many of those apps are also selling our location information, our location history, to data brokers. And some of those data brokers have figured out that they can make a lot of money, millions of dollars, selling our location records to the government. These are GPS location points collected many times a day for many people with apps on their smartphones, which can chart an incredibly detailed picture of our patterns of life, where we spend time, who we spend time with, where we spend the night. Do we go to a psychiatrist's office or a liquor store or an AA meeting? You name it, you can infer it from these records.
So, Nate, even clumsy cell phone users like me know how to opt out. Does that provide any protection about what you're talking about?
Yes. Opting out of location services being accessible by apps on your phone absolutely can help protect against this particular threat. And people should really do that. I keep location services on my phone turned off unless I'm actively using a mapping app. You can also, on Android phones and iPhones, turn off app by app access to location services. People should absolutely do that. At the end of the day, though, this is a systemic level problem, and a lot of people lack the know-how or the time or the kind of energy to be constantly on top of protecting their digital privacy. Which means we really need policy solutions. We need the law to keep up. And there is legislation, bipartisan legislation in Congress right now that would do just that.
Nate, you mentioned a staggering amount. Can you give the audience a sense of the scale of this acquisition paid for by the federal government?
Yeah, so we released documents, including marketing materials from one of these data brokers that's selling this location data to the government, crowing about how they collect 15 billion, that's with a B, location points for more than 250 million phones and other mobile devices every single day. And all of that data is in a database that's searchable by the government just because they've bought a contract with this data broker. Among the records also were a dump of more than 6,000 pages of spreadsheets of actual raw location data. The agencies redacted the GPS points, the coordinates there, but gave us enough information that we could count up just in a small little subset covering just a small number of days, how much location data is there. And we found that, in 3 days from 2018 that happened to be in the spreadsheet, drawn, we think, from just a particular area in the southwestern United States, there were more than 113,000 location points. That's 26 location points per day from an unknown number of people. We don't know what the coverage is. By any metric, this is an incredible amount of people's private sensitive data that we would expect and that the Supreme Court has explained is protected by the Fourth Amendment. And yet we have agencies buying their way effectively around those constitutional protections.
Nate, explain to the audience in a general sense how this data might be used in either an investigation or creating a trackable or definable tracing of an American for any number of reasons.
Yeah, this data is really powerful and can be used in a number of ways. One way is that a government agent can decide they want to know everybody who is in a particular area in a particular time frame. Now, they might be investigating a crime and sweep in information about every bystander, every resident of that neighborhood who is nearby in the course of it. They might be looking at a particularly sensitive location, see who is nearby it, who knows. Or investigators might be trying to zero in on a particular person and track their location, and their movements, their activities backward and forward in time. One of the things that the government says in these documents, and the data brokers say in these documents, to try to justify their buying of this data instead of going to a judge and getting a warrant, is that, you know what, there are no names, no cell phone users' names are in here. It's just numerical identifiers associated with their phone. It's not that private anyway. Of course, the entire point of this information is to be able to track people, identify people, investigate people, and do it extremely fast at very low cost to the government. They just buy a contract and then they get to do it. It's really sensitive stuff. And without any kind of judicial oversight or legislative oversight, it's just ripe for abuse. Having government access to the most sensitive details of our comings and goings over time is just not how we want to be doing business in this country.
And Nate, as I understand this process began during the Trump administration, but has continued during the Biden administration?
That's right. These contracts have been renewed. There are several data brokers that appear in the records that we got from the Department of Homeland Security. We know that there are other federal agencies that are also buying access to this data. It seems to have continued basically unabated between administrations.
And that's why you are supportive of legislation to put new rules of the road around this.
That's right. What the legislation would do, it's called the Fourth Amendment is Not for Sale Act. It's bipartisan. It's been introduced in the House and the Senate. And in fact, just this week, there was a hearing in the House where Republican and Democratic representatives were strongly supporting this legislation and really calling for the need for it to be enacted. It would take away the ability of these federal agencies to buy their way around constitutional protections by just opening the federal wallet and spending taxpayer dollars. It would effectively say that if law enforcement wants to get access to these highly sensitive private records, they need to go to a judge and get a warrant or a similar appropriate court order. That's already what the Supreme Court has said law enforcement needs to do when they go to our cell phone companies to get our location history from them. And what this legislation would recognize is there's absolutely no logical reason not to apply the very same protections to this equally sensitive location information that's just coming from a different source, coming from a data broker that took it from an app on our phone instead of coming from our cell phone provider that's getting it from their cell towers.
Nathan Freed-Wessler with the ACLU. Thanks so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Great talking.
We are going to take a quick break, and that means you have a couple of minutes to download the free CBS News app on all your devices. You can catch live local coverage from across the country from all of our CBS stations. And guess what? While you're at it, you get to check out Paramount Plus. We have got a mountain, oh yes, a mountain of content for you to stream there as well. That includes your favorite shows, movies, and sports.
CBS News Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley on CBS.
When weather is about to get extreme.
We're talking about hail, we're talking about tornadoes, damaging winds.
Every second counts.
Let's now take a look at what that really means to you.
That's why CBS News and the Weather Channel have come together to bring you virtual weather technology so advanced, so real.
We can show you what it's going to look like when the storms come through.
You'll see what will happen, where it will happen, before it does. Feel the forecast on CBS News. Time to get prepared.
I'm Nora O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You've never done an interview like this before.
That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News. What's your message to consumers? They need help now. Tell him I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Nora O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount Plus.
We will witness yet another moment in history.
Former President Trump and his family came together in New York City today for the funeral of Mr. Trump's first wife, Ivana Trump. She died last week after an accidental fall. Ivana Trump was born in the Czech Republic and was a skier and model before marrying Donald Trump in 1977. Former President Trump called his ex-wife, quote, a wonderful, beautiful, and amazing woman who led a great and inspirational life, unquote. Ivana Trump was the mother of Donald Jr., Ivanka, and Eric Trump. She was 73. That does it for today. You can stream Red and Blue Monday to Thursday at 6 p.m. Eastern. More news after the break. You are streaming CBS News.
CBS News Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley on CBS.
when weather is about to get extreme.
We're talking about hail, we're talking about tornadoes, damaging wind.
Every second counts.
Let's now take a look at what that really means to you.
That's why CBS News and the Weather Channel have come together to bring you virtual weather technology so advanced, so real.
We can show you what it's going to look like when the storms come through.
You'll see what will happen, where it will happen, before it does. Feel the forecast on CBS News. Time to get prepared.
I'm Nora O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
We've never done an interview like this before.
That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News. What's your message to consumers? They need help now. Tell him I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Nora O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount Plus.
We will witness yet another moment in history.
Americans across the country react to the Supreme Court's ruling on abortion, understanding the landmark decision and its impact. For continuing coverage anywhere,
Welcome, you're streaming CBS News. I'm John Dickerson. Thank you for joining us for the hour. Here's a look at some of the top stories we are following at the moment. If you're watching in America, it's a good bet it's hot where you are. The majority of states in the United States are under heat advisories. In England, temperature records aren't just being broken by a degree or two, but several. We're on the ground sweating in Texas and Rome, Italy, with the latest. President Biden announced emergency measures to combat the climate change baking the planet. We'll explain what he can and cannot do without Congress. Ukraine's First Lady tells U.S. lawmakers Russia is destroying our people. Elena Zelenska's plea for more aid. And later this hour, baby formula